Hello, I'm Phil Klein, and I'd like to welcome you back to an interview I have today with a friend of mine, someone I've come to know through our efforts in election integrity and to rein in the perpetual use of police powers. And we're going to be talking about how freedom is not complicated, but it seems as if our culture and our government leaders today are making it so. I've got with me Tom Breth, who has been an Amistad attorney working for us. He works out there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with Tom King. And Tom, I'm gonna start out with a discussion with you about Governor Wolf and COVID. And you and Tom King led really a case of national implications. But first, I want to ask you a general question, Tom. What about government's response to COVID do you think they got right? And what do you think they're getting wrong?
Well, first of all, Phil, thanks for being with you. I'd be remiss if I didn't send my best wishes from Tom King. He's traveling today, as you know. It's been a pleasure to work with you over the last 6 months on the Amistad project. I think that, and it's not only in Pennsylvania, it's unfortunate that there have been Republican and Democrat governors throughout this country that I think have let the emotions of the pandemic, and certainly we're not disputing the severity of the pandemic. It's horrific, the impact it's had on so many families of the lost loved ones, including my own family, with respect to that. But as we all know, more so than any other country on the face of the earth, we appreciate and respect and treasure our personal liberties. And even in difficult times, such as a pandemic, we have to safeguard those, and we have to stop and say, are our actions in response to this pandemic in violation of our civil rights? So I think that in Pennsylvania, and I'll speak to Pennsylvania primarily, I think in Pennsylvania, I think the general response of saying, listen, educating the public and saying this is the pandemic, this is how the pandemic is spread based upon the experts that we've consulted with. I think they got that right. I think their efforts to bring the pandemic to the public's attention were good, and I think they've been good throughout the pandemic. I think there are educational efforts on the steps that each individual citizen can take to safeguard themselves and others, wearing masks, social distancing, your basic hygiene, washing your hands, not touching your face or your mouth with your hands. All of those things, I think the government's done a very nice job of doing it. Where I think they broke down is they've gone beyond that, and they've said, we don't trust the citizens in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to apply those standards, to follow those rules. So we're going to start to mandate to businesses and to other entities what they have to do, putting congregate restrictions in place, forcing businesses to shut down. It's all because they don't believe that the citizenry and those businesses can operate in a safe manner free from government interference. That's really where I think the fundamental breakdown has occurred.
It's interesting. I was up in Michigan early in the pandemic, well, probably about August, I guess, of 2020. And Governor Whitmer sent out a news release claiming credit, saying that her policies of shutting down the economy have saved so many thousands of Michiganders' lives. And it hit me how presumptuous that is. Presumptuous in that she believed that she needed to threaten her fellow Michiganders and their neighbors with jail before they would act in respect to those who are vulnerable and take common sense steps to protect the vulnerable. So yeah, I think you're right. I think you hit on something. It really is a reflection of a policy that you can't trust the citizenry. So we've got to threaten you with incarceration to get you to take some common sense steps as it relates to the pandemic. How do you sense that has harmed the fabric of community in where you live, and the fabric or the opportunity that people have and the faith that they have in their governance?
I think it has. Obviously, I'm a little north of Pittsburgh in Butler County. I like to refer to Butler County as the most conservative county in the country. It is a very
Because you're
grassroots.
there.
Well, I won't take credit for it,
The most
but I'm
conservative county is where Tom Breth happens to be.
That's exactly.
Okay.
But it's a great place to live. It has impacted, I think, the fabric of our community. I live in a community where there are a lot of community events, everything from farm shows and 4-H livestock options to fairs and local car shows and things of that nature, that the community gets together. And, hunting's a very big activity, gun raffles and things of that nature with the volunteer fire departments and things. Moving that to a virtual format, it's just not the same community event. I think everybody longs to get back to the opportunity to get together and spend time, just spending time together and talking about our lives. I think it's unfortunate. I think we're yet to see the impact it's had on churches and synagogues and other houses of worship that have really tried to be good citizens and followed the directive that the state governments and local governments have put down. But I know when I go to church on Sundays, it's a fraction of the people that would ordinarily be there. And I'm probably one of the younger parishioners. There are some, the young kids are still there, but they're not in the numbers. The average age of, the 100 or so people that are in church is probably well over 60. And that is a scary, scary situation that this pandemic has put restrictions on our religious freedoms, but it's also, quite honestly, served a little bit as an excuse not to get up on Sunday mornings or not to get up on your weekday mornings and go to church.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow my own. What I usually ask people to do is turn off their phone. I'm powering off. I'm sorry to interrupt you there. So church attendance is down. Youth aren't engaged in church. I'm curious as to this, if you've seen this too. I've always thought that fear speaks to our darker side often and tempts our darker side. And there are stories that pop up here and there where, for example, in communities where people might not have a mask on, that their neighbors are ratting them out or sending emails about how they're caring for their children. And I've also always believed this, that when government gets intimately involved in something, it becomes the business of everybody. So, when government starts telling us what to do in every aspect of our life, everybody starts to think they can start telling us what to do about every aspect of our life. Have you sensed that? Have you experienced kind of a broken fabric there as it relates to how neighbor relates to neighbor?
There's no question about it. In Pennsylvania, they adopted a mobile app that you could download on your phone, and not only was it a tool to provide you with information with respect to contact tracing and things of that nature, but it was also used as a vehicle for you to report to the government what you were observing with respect to your fellow citizens and their failure to comply with the mandates of the government, which to me is a very, very scary process to start to implement, and a mindset. And it's a mind creep that it's not immediate, but over time it desensitizes you to the whole concept of, oh, it's okay to basically report to your government. And I'm not talking about somebody that's, getting mugged in a dark alley, right, or somebody's breaking into your neighbor's house. I'm talking about individuals that, quite honestly, are enjoying their own civil liberties and their own freedoms, but they're not doing it in a manner consistent with what the government says is the appropriate manner of enjoying that. To me, it'll be interesting to see if we truly transition out of this pandemic and resume what most of us would consider normal. I fear that we're not going to do that for a very extended period of time if we ever fully get back. But if we do that, it'll be interesting.
You're not speaking about the threat of the pandemic. You're speaking about how we relate to one another. because of how the pandemic has been managed by government.
Well, absolutely. I was out last night. My mother's side of the family is 100% Irish. So St. Patrick's Day is near and dear to my heart. That not only is a religious holiday, but also as just a social activity. And I was speaking to some folks from a neighboring county, and they said it feels weird because we were in a restaurant, and Butler County is a little bit different because we're a little less concerned or afraid of, if somebody doesn't have their mask on. It's no one would say something. At least I've never had an experience where I've seen somebody say to another person, "Why don't you have your mask on?" or starting to question them. And this individual came out of the Pittsburgh area, and he said, I felt a little uncomfortable. He said, "I'm not concerned about the mask wearing. It was different for me, and I didn't feel comfortable just instinctively being around people without masks on." So it's that type of impact, I think, that it's going to take a long time.
You can feel the judgment in the air, wherever you are, whether you have one on or you don't have it. And in fact, I would challenge most people, when we wear one and see a person without, sometimes our mind goes to a judgment. Now that's far different than reporting them to law enforcement. And I am also concerned about this, Tom. When you look at the breadth of these laws, we also have a joint concern, and I want to get into your case in County of Butler, but we have a joint concern about governors declaring themselves to be the law rather than part of the lawmaking process. I mean, when did the left lose faith in a representative republic? Well, evidently now they don't have faith in the process and of a representative republic or a democratic republic. They only have faith in dictatorial pronouncements, it seems, by government to handle emergencies. But as a part of that, we have regulations that cover every aspect of human life. I mean, whether you can stand 5 feet 11 inches from another human being or 6 feet 1. Whether your mask covers, I don't know if I'm breaking it in here. I'm in my office alone. I'm not sure, I might be. Whether your mask covers just your mouth or your mouth and your nose, and you could go to jail. And when the breadth is that wide, there's no police force that can enforce it, no public that can enforce it, no human being that can comply with it all the time. I mean, you saw the picture of John Kerry without his mask on the plane, and he said, "Oh, I just lowered it for a minute." It's still a violation, by the way. Nobody can comply all the time. And so it's arbitrary and capricious, isn't it? It's being enforced against people based on whether they raise their head and complain or protest or happen to have a persnickety neighbor who doesn't like the way they mow their grass and phones it in.
I mean, I agree with you. And I kind of chuckle with the airline analogy because I've done some traveling in the last, 6 months, and you have to, when you're booking your flight, you have to, affirm that you are going to wear your mask and comply with their rules. And you walk onto the plane, and the crew's there, and they greet you, with a smile, I'm assuming, with their mask on. And then they hand you a little bag because they don't have the beverage service. So they hand you this little bag when you get on. And I look in the bag, and there's hand sanitizer, but there's every excuse possible to take your mask off. There's a little bottle of water, which if you drink in your bottle of water, you can remove your mask. There's a little snack. If you're eating a snack, you can remove your mask. And I'm just like, the inconsistency in the approach. They're telling you on one hand, you absolutely have to wear a mask. It's absolutely essential. We're not going to permit you on. If you take it off, we're going to, you're going to get in all kinds of trouble. But then they create 16 different exceptions, and there's no concern. Like if I'm drinking water, somehow everybody in the plane is immune to
bothered by it. Yeah, COVID squeeze bottled water, I think.
Absolutely. So I think there's, and it changes so much. The government regulations have changed so much, and they're not even regulations. I shouldn't even use that terminology because they don't go through a regulatory process. The governmental edicts that come out of the departments of health and the executive branch, they're so inconsistent I have so many clients that are just trying to be good citizens and say, listen, we're not looking to break the rules, but you're creating such a bureaucracy that we can't understand what the rules are. And these are intelligent people that are honestly spending enormous amount of time and resources trying to make sure they comply because they're inconsistent.
And
I see that in a number of areas.
When you have that inconsistency and you have that arbitrary application, it really keeps everybody in fear, doesn't it?
It really does. And Phill, I had a group out of Philadelphia, some religious-based schools, both of the Jewish faith and the Christian faith reached out to me, and the Amistad Project was gracious enough to support our efforts. And in Montgomery County, which is just beside Philadelphia County, in the eastern part of the state, they have their own county board of health. So while the governor through the state's department, the Commonwealth's Department of Education, put restrictions on public schools, they specifically excluded religious-based schools and private schools, surprisingly, non-religious private schools. But Montgomery County put a restriction and forced all of the schools within Montgomery County to go virtual. So we brought federal complaint against them and said, listen, you cannot restrict our ability to worship. Our schools are an integral part of our faith. You can't separate. It's this equivalent of closing our churches. We were successful in addressing it in the county. Ultimately, their order expired. And they brought it under the Commonwealth's order, the governor's order. So the religious-based schools were free to resume control and operate in-person instruction. But it's that type of infringement that people just kind of take for granted. And at the same time, there's casinos in Montgomery County, or a casino in Montgomery County was free to operate. All of these other activities are free to operate. And at the same time, the CDC saying schools are the safest place for students to be. There isn't data to support the closing of schools because of any kind of super spreader or high levels of spreading of COVID-19. So I just think we're still operating, even a year after the pandemic really hit the United States, we're still operating in an area where the government is trying to create a sense of fear. So people aren't thinking about, hold on, this just really doesn't make any sense from just a common sense standpoint.
Yeah, fear, a frightful people is a more controllable people.
Absolutely.
And it seems like fear is the primary currency in politics today. I mean, just think about how the goalposts have moved on COVID to preserve fear. All of the initial estimates were wrong. Now they will claim that the shutdown saved us from that, but no, they are grossly off. And first, the goal was to prevent the overwhelming flow into the medical system that we couldn't respond. Well, we never even came close to overwhelming this medical system. And by the way, the reason I believe that we didn't is because we've had an entrepreneurial nation generally, rather than government trying to manufacture a response. The private sector did a pretty darn good job when they focused with good leadership to provide what we needed. And I wonder what the goalpost is now. Why do we continue these lockdowns rather than protect the vulnerable and allow people to exercise freedom with responsibility?
I agree completely. I think it's both a function of the private industry that didn't overwhelm our healthcare systems, and quite honestly, the responsible nature of our citizens. We have clients throughout the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. There's Pittsburgh on the western part of the state, in Philadelphia, and then there's smaller communities throughout. But there's a lot of rural communities that have, if they're lucky, they might have a small hospital. But most of them, there's a small hospital regional area. they weren't overwhelmed because the citizens that are served by those healthcare facilities realize that they don't have 16 hospitals to choose from. They've got one. They acted in a responsible manner. That's the part that government never, ever takes into consideration, that they could have very easily, when this pandemic started, and this was one of the issues that was in our case on behalf of Butler County and all of our plaintiffs against the governor. They put all of these nonsensical congregate rules in place. If you were this type of facility, you could have 15 people, or that type of facility, you could have 25 people. Instead of saying, listen, these are the safeguards, the protocols you need to take. Wear a mask, wash your hands, social distance, all of those things. And across the board, everybody can be at 10% capacity, 15% capacity, 20% capacity of their occupancy permit. So that if you're a little mom and pop store that's selling hardware or groceries or a restaurant, you can operate at the same 25% capacity that Lowe's or Home Depot or these big box stores could operate at. They didn't do that. They shut down all the smaller places, which forced everybody to go to the big locations, didn't put capacity limitations on them. And quite honestly, it's counterproductive to the spread of COVID. It really wasn't. And no matter what the numbers are, almost all of the politicians come out and say, but we saved all these lives. Well, you can't disprove that. I mean, it's a self-serving statement that we saved all these lives because nobody can disprove it.
Nobody can prove it either.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. It's what a wonderful place to be for a politician, to be able to claim something that you don't have to prove because it's not provable, but nobody can disprove it.
Yeah, right. It's quite fascinating throughout this conversation. You've kind of referred to the disequal treatment that has occurred, and I don't believe that there's anything that causes greater erosion to the fabric of a free society than if some people are treated above the law, some people are treated below the law, disequal treatment or a violation of equal protection. We had it with slavery and we fought a war. It was so corrosive. We had it with Jim Crow and we went through a season of violence and still deal with racism and all of that. And are we entering a new season where with all of these regulations and rules that certain people are favored or certain groups are favored and certain groups are disfavored? And so there are people who believe the law would apply differently.
I think we really are. And it's a different type it's an economic treatment, and all the things that you referenced obviously had an economic component to that disparate treatment and discrimination. I think really it's a new type of discrimination that's harder to define. It's hard to say, well, I sell this product, but I'm closed down. But there's a company down the road, a mile, that sells the same product plus a couple other things, and they're permitted to operate. It's not your traditional type of discrimination or the disparate treatment. So I've seen a ton of clients and other businesses in the community that, quite honestly, many of them are hanging on. Some of them I don't think are going to survive this. And you think of it in the context of purely, that's a business activity. No, it isn't. It's a fundamental right that we as Americans have. It's what separates us. It's their liberties. It's not, your hardware store got shut down or your restaurant has all of these restrictions. You think of it in an economic term. It's not an economic term. It's a freedom term. It's a civil liberties. You're not just saying I have to shut down my business. That's how I pay my bills. That's how I educate my kids. That's how I buy my health care. All of those things is what's being denied. It's not just simply, you're going to have these restrictions on your business operations. Well, you take 75% of anybody's income and just look how that impacts every aspect of their lives. That's the damage. It's not because they're only going to they're not going to make what they made last year. Well, yeah, that's one aspect of it, but it's the denial of the ability to pursue life, liberty, and happiness in our country. That's, to me, is the civil liberties that are being violated.
And this cancer seems to enter every time government assumes the role of picking favorites.
Correct.
Of benefiting certain groups. And it's quite fascinating, your observation as it relates to the big stores and the mom and pops that are shut down. We have witnessed through these shutdowns one of the biggest transfers of wealth in our national history. And it's gone to billionaires, and it's gone to big tech, and it's gone to a lot of those who have supported these shutdowns with their advertising, their messaging, and their political involvement. I wonder, as this fabric of American culture seems to be frayed out of fear, as elected officials continue to use fear as a way to manage our population. You go to Washington, D.C. right now, it's surrounded in razor wire, as if that we are the threat to D.C. You have children, don't you?
I don't. No.
You don't?
Okay.
No. Tom, do you think that our youth are understanding what's going on and are raising the right questions as you look at this?
I don't know if they're raising the right questions. I think my general sense is they're much more tolerant of, I think massive progress has been made in the concept of civil rights, and there's still a long ways to go there. But I think my experience with the generations younger than I am is they're much more tolerant with each other, and they have a better there's less discrimination in the younger generations. Unfortunately, I don't have a feeling that they have a strong concept or passion for civil liberties in the context of our government. They don't like to see the interactions, the personal interactions, the racial discrimination, the transgender issues, the gay lesbian issues. They're much more tolerant in those areas, but I don't see them as fearful as my generation and older generations are of the government. I think they're more like, okay, well, the government's telling us we need to do that, so okay, we'll do that, not understanding the impact that they're having, the government's having on them, the civil liberties that the government's imposing restrictions on. They're suspect of private businesses discriminating, disparate treatment in the private sector. The governmental sector, I think they're blind to it.
So they would turn to government very quickly to resolve a lot of issues that we wouldn't turn to government to resolve, I suppose.
I think so. That's my general impression. And I know an awful lot that are very conservative and don't appreciate that, understand that. I just think that the general population, and I'm trying to take it out of context of where I live, because where I live is the younger generation absolutely gets it, because their parents have fostered it.
What would you say to those who don't get that concern? What would be your message to a generation of Americans who has come to believe that government interaction in all areas of life is wise to solve the problems that we face as a nation and a culture? Well,
I try to encourage them to look at what other countries have gone through. One of the things that I think that my niece was in town, and my niece is a junior in college, and she was in town for a family birthday, and she brought her boyfriend over, who's looking to go to graduate school. And we were talking, and both of them are pretty politically attuned to what's going on. And we started talking about the national debt, which is not a conversation that you hear very often.
Yeah.
and all of the stimulus money.
Even in the state houses and in Congress right now. It's
Absolutely. And I said, you need to pay attention to what your government's doing, because the music's going to stop at some point. We've pumped 6 trillion or so into the economy last year in COVID relief. Another trillion, 2 trillion almost this year. And quite honestly, it's categorized as COVID relief. Anybody that's taken any time to look at it realize that it's pork, masquerading as COVID relief. A lot of it has absolutely nothing to do with COVID, but political pork that's going through to the home states. But that generation is going to have to. Our federal government can't continue to operate the way it's operating without there being a day of reckoning.
Yeah. So a sense of history is important, because we've seen just about everything under the sun. And if we study history and human behavior and politics, we learn that nations that go this path too aggressively end up in a place where they don't want to be, nor does a freedom-loving society want to be. So, Tom, thank you. I greatly appreciate your time. I appreciate your input. And I didn't get to a lot about County of Butler versus Wolf, but I'll have Tom King on, and he'll get the glory of talking about that case. And I really appreciate your insight. And it's my honor to have stood with you in the fire, buddy, and to continue to do that. I appreciate you as a man. I appreciate you as an attorney, and thank you for your time today.
Well, Phill, I appreciate it likewise. And Tom will do a better job than I did on touting the Wolf matter.
Well, I didn't even ask you a question.
That's fine.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Thanks, everybody.
Fundamentally, as we look at what has happened over the past 18 months in America, it comes down to an understanding of what you believe the purpose and function of government is, as well as, in practical terms, whether it can fulfill the purpose of which it claims. And should government be in the role of protecting us from all risk, all harm, and even, as some claim today, all offense, to be protected from somebody offending us? Freedom is a very, very vulnerable place in which to reside. I believe it's the most profoundly natural and required to be respected condition in which a human being can find themselves. But it is a vulnerable place. It is frightening when you are a free people, because freedom entails responsibility. It entails making wise choices amongst a myriad of choices. And freedom is not about safety. Never has been. It's about expression. Oftentimes it's about risk. And so as we look at the purpose and function of government, whether it is to protect us in the exercise of our inherent freedom or to protect us from all risk, I think we will begin to understand why we are seeing the things that we are seeing, and force us to make a choice between liberty or a false sense of safety. I'm Phill Klein. I appreciate you joining us, and I hope to see you again.